I thought I would just take a brief moment and attempt to describe the phenomenon of self consciousness as I have come to understand it. Although this representation is what one might reasonably call hyper simple, I've been given no reason based on my own consideration and analysis, as well as sharing this with others and receiving no pushback. I've been given no reason to believe that this does not effectively and accurately describe the phenomenon and how it operates. This being one of the questions that has plagued or interested man since as long as we can remember, just about as long as there have been writings, I would argue. I think this is an important consideration to share with people if they can gain anything from it, or share my outlook that this seems to be an effective description of what's going on with the phenomenon of self-consciousness, of knowing ourselves. So in the brain, you could imagine there are two like machines, if you will. Your unconscious brain, represented here by a closed eye, and your conscious brain, represented by an open eye. Your conscious brain and your self-conscious faculties seem, to the best of our understanding, to stem from a different physical part of the brain primarily, the frontal lobar cortex, whereas this is much of the rest of the brain above the brain stem, which is almost like another brain. So you almost have three different brains. Your brain stem for like breathing and your heart beating, and unconscious brain for the intake and analysis of most external inputs, and then your self-conscious faculties, which secondarily analyze and meta-analyze all of this data. So typically your unconscious brain, whether it is your auditory cortex or your visual cortex, etc., they're going to be taking in stimuli, external stimuli, whether that's sight, sound, etc., represented here by an exclamation mark. They're taking in that input, and it is forming some sort of analysis. It is forming some sorts of thought here that then gets sent, or rather read, by the conscious brain, the conscious brain later. And also, I have, as a quick aside, I've represented both the conscious and unconscious brain here as meat and bone, because that is like the physicality, the actual physical cells, the machine doing it. And this other stuff represented with a lightning bolt is the electrical signals passing between those nerve cells. These are like the nerve cells themselves, clusters thereof, this and this. And these are the electrical signals passing between them that are representations of, or actually are, thought and memory. So the unconscious brain takes in these external stimuli, tries to make some sense of them in the form of an electrical signal and that's stored in the brain, and how it arranges neurons and makes connections. But the self-conscious, conscious, or self-conscious, however you want to call it, part of your brain, the frontal lobar cortex, it's constantly, you can imagine this is a little camera, it is constantly looking at all of these inputs that the unconscious brain is putting out, like all of the analysis and conclusions that the unconscious brain has arrived at. The conscious brain looks at those little parts, those conclusions, if you will, here. See them being passed along here. And it looks at them, and then it outputs them. It organizes them into thought clusters, into ideas and such that are related and should be considered jointly when the brain and the person is considering these sorts of ideas if they're going to survive effectively in the environment. So external inputs to the unconscious brain, it sends them as analyses or conclusions it's arrived at that will help the body survive the environment. The conscious part of the brain is constantly looking through all of the outputs of the unconscious brain, all the conclusions, and saying, okay, well, actually, these conclusions go together and these conclusions don't go together, and further secondarily and more effectively analyzing the data that's being received ultimately from external outputs. However, where the faculty and phenomenon of self-consciousness arises is once this has, your conscious or self-conscious part of your brain has produced this output, has organized successfully some of these thoughts and concepts that are being presented to it from the unconscious brain, it sends those on out back to the unconscious part of the brain, back to the greater majority of what your physical brain is. And because this self-conscious part of your brain is always scanning and rescanning and scanning and rescanning all of the conclusions and information stored in the rest of your unconscious brain, it inevitably comes across data that is, and conclusions that it has already organized. So it's taking these thoughts in from the unconscious brain, it's grouping them, and then when those get sent back to the unconscious brain, the conscious brain later reads those and goes, wait, I'm supposed to organize these, but they're already in the proper, organizations here. There's nothing left to do. So in the course of the brain, either trying to reconsider and reorganize these or deciding that it doesn't need to at all, it sees its own work effectively. It says, this is something I already did. This is me effectively. So the information that it has already processed is the information it also ultimately receives again. And in that feedback loop is a sense of self, essentially as a phenomenon. And so yeah, that has been the way that I have come to best understand the process of self-consciousness. It is hard for one, and has been historically, to conceive of a feedback loop that seems to have no entry point. But this is, I believe, the way to describe that. There is a constant entry point to that constant feedback loop of self-consideration. But not all of the thoughts coming in as inputs will be perceived as oneself. Only the older thoughts and conclusions, once read again, will be how we experience what we call conscious thoughts, and the concepts and stuff that we are constantly receiving new from our environment that haven't yet been analyzed are the thoughts that our conscious brain can kind of feel but doesn't completely experience. So this is, to the best of my understanding, how, as a phenomenon, we experience conscious and unconscious thoughts.